The auction of the fragile human, the great hall of the interstellar market, was alive with sound and movement and color. Banners of alien houses hung from the high metal beams, and lights shimmered like stars over the wide floor. Merchants shouted the worth of rare creatures and artifacts, while bidders argued in voices that echoed against the steel walls. Strange smells filled the air, the scent of burning oils mixed with the sharp taste of metal and dust from faraway worlds. The crowd was restless, searching for power and novelty, and every eye waited for the next offering. At the center stood the raised platform of the auctioneers. Many creatures had already been sold that day, beasts with scales like armor, slaves with muscles bred for war, singers whose voices could charm even the hardest heart. The crowd was rich and demanding, and every purchase was made with pride. Yet when the next figure was brought out, a hush fell that was not born of awe but of disbelief. It was a human. He was tall by the standards of his kind, yet seemed small among the towering aliens. His arms were thin though strong in their own way, his skin pale under the harsh light, his eyes bright but shadowed with exhaustion. He wore the simple chains of a slave, nothing more than iron links, and his steps were heavy as guards pushed him forward. The auctioneer raised a hand for silence, and then his voice rang out over the crowd. "Here we have a rare specimen," he declared with false grandeur. "A human from the lost world, taken from the forgotten rim. Fragile, yes, but unique. Who will start the bidding?" Laughter rolled across the hall. A lizard-faced merchant leaned on his staff and shook his head. "Too weak, their bones break too easily." A wide-bodied warrior with tusks bared his teeth in a grin. "I would not waste a single credit on such soft flesh. He would not last a day in the pits." Others joined in with mocking tones. "Humans are nothing but fragile shells. No claws, no armor, no strength. Who would dare to buy such a creature?" The auctioneer forced a smile, but his voice grew strained. He called out a low starting price, yet no hands rose. He dropped it lower, but the bidders only jeered. Some turned away as if insulted that such a being would even be offered in their presence. The human stood silent, his head bowed, his thoughts hidden, but inside his chest his heart beat with the weight of despair. The guards shoved him to his knees so he could be displayed more clearly. One struck him across the back to prove his weakness, and the crowd laughed louder. The auctioneer's voice tried again, desperate, announcing that humans were clever, quick learners, able to serve in many ways. But still no one stepped forward. The hall was a storm of mockery and rejection. The human lifted his head slightly. His name was Ethan. He did not speak, for he knew his words would not matter. In their eyes he was nothing more than a fragile toy, unworthy of value. He stared at the sea of faces, at the scaled skin, the armored shells, the glowing eyes, and he felt the weight of being so very small among them. Yet inside him there was a quiet flame that refused to go out. He thought of the lost blue world of his birth, of mountains and rivers he would never see again, and he clenched his jaw to keep from falling completely into despair. The auctioneer finally raised both hands in defeat. His voice trembled with anger. "No one will bid? Shall I cast this human aside like waste? Will none of you take him, even for nothing?" The crowd roared with amusement. "Throw him to the beasts!" One shouted, "Let him be fed to the machines." Another laughed. Guards began to drag Ethan from the stage, their grips harsh, ready to end the humiliation. And then the hall grew silent. It was not the silence of boredom, but the silence of awe and fear. From the far side of the chamber, the great doors opened, with a thunder that shook the floor. Soldiers in gleaming armor marched through in perfect step, their banners carried high, their faces stern and unyielding. Behind them came attendants in robes that shimmered like flowing fire. At the center walked a figure cloaked in deep crimson, her crown catching the light like a shard of the sun. The Empress had arrived, Every alien in the hall bent low or bowed their heads. The auctioneer froze in place, sweat running down his face. The guards holding Ethan stiffened, uncertain whether to drop him or keep him steady. The Empress walked with calm steps, her gaze fixed forward, her presence alone heavier than any army. She moved until she stood before the stage, and the hall seemed to hold its breath. Her eyes fell upon the human. For a long moment she said nothing. Ethan met her gaze with quiet defiance, though fear trembled in his chest. She studied him as if seeing not just his body, but the spark within. The auctioneer's voice broke the silence, hurried and nervous. "Your Majesty, forgive this poor display. A human, nothing of worth. We were about to remove him." The Empress raised a hand, and the words died. Her voice was soft but carried. Like thunder through the hall. "I want him." Gasps spread across the crowd. Merchants whispered to each other in disbelief. Warriors shook their heads in shock. Even the guards' hands faltered on Ethan's arms. None could understand why the ruler of a vast empire would speak such words for a creature so scorned. The auctioneer stammered, unable to form a reply. The Empress stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Ethan. "This one," she said again, with finality. "He is mine." And with that the fate of the fragile human was sealed. The arrival of the Empress, the guards released their grip as the Empress's words echoed through the hall, and the crowd held its silence with fear and curiosity. No one dared question her choice, for she was more than a ruler. She was the voice of power itself. Ethan stood uncertain on his weak knees, the chain still locked around his wrists, yet in that single moment, something had changed. The eyes of every creature in the market no longer looked at him with mocking laughter, but with disbelief and whispers of what this decision might mean. The auctioneer bowed so low that his forehead almost touched the floor. His voice shook as he tried to please her. "Of course, Majesty, of course. The human is yours. Take him as you will. It is an honor, a great honor, for this unworthy hall to be the place of your choice." He waved his trembling hands toward the guards, and they quickly pushed Ethan forward. The Empress's soldiers stepped between them with silent authority and took the human into their protection. The hall was alive again, but this time with hushed tones and hurried guesses. Why would the Empress desire such a weak creature? Why would she waste her time and presence on a fragile human when she could command any warrior, any weapon, any empire? Some thought it was a whim, others whispered it might be some hidden plan, while a few feared it was the beginning of something no one could yet see. The Empress said nothing more, only turned and left the chamber as her soldiers guided Ethan behind her. Outside, the great halls of the auction house faded into the wider streets of the capital. Towers of steel and crystal reached into the sky, glowing with light and energy. Airships drifted above, their shadows sliding across the roads. Crowds parted wherever the Empress passed, their heads lowered, their voices quiet. Ethan walked among her escort, the cold weight of his chains clinking with every step. He kept his head lowered, not out of respect but out of confusion, for he could not understand why she had chosen him. They reached the palace as the sun of that world burned low over the horizon. The palace was a fortress of beauty, walls of white stone carved with symbols of power, gates guarded by soldiers in silver armor, and gardens where strange flowers glowed in colors he had never seen before. Ethan was led through grand corridors where every surface shone like polished crystal. The air smelled of incense and rare oils, and the silence was heavy with the presence of history. At last they entered a chamber vast and high, its ceiling painted with scenes of victory and rule. At the far end stood the throne, simple yet radiant, and upon it the Empress sat with calm grace. Her crown glimmered with the light of the hall, and her gaze rested on Ethan as though she measured not his chains, but the fire hidden within his soul. The guards set him at the foot of the throne and stepped back. For a long moment the Empress did not speak. Ethan felt the weight of her eyes, stronger than the chains that bound him. He forced himself to lift his head and meet her stare. Though his heart thundered in his chest, he thought of the jeering voices in the market and wondered if this was some crueler game, another stage for mockery. Finally her voice filled the chamber, calm and steady. "Do you know why they laughed at you today?" Ethan's throat was dry. But he found words. "Because they see only weakness in me." The Empress nodded slowly. "And do you believe them?" He hesitated. He thought of his narrow shoulders, his thin arms, his frail body compared to the giants of steel and scale he had seen. He thought of how easily a blow had sent him to his knees. Yet he also thought of long nights of survival, of battles fought with nothing but courage, of a will that refused to break. His voice came out rough but steady. "No, they do not understand what strength is." A flicker passed over her face, perhaps the hint of a smile. "Good, then you see what they cannot." She leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, human, what do you think of me?" The question struck him with surprise. He had expected commands or threats, not curiosity. He searched for an answer and finally said, "You are feared. You are obeyed. Yet you do not hide behind your crown. You came yourself when you could have sent others. That tells me you are more than they say." Her attendants stirred, shocked that a slave would speak so openly, but the Empress silenced them with a glance. She studied Ethan with new intensity, as though peeling away the surface to glimpse the truth inside. "I chose you," she said. "At last, because I grow weary of voices that only echo what I already know. My court is filled with advisors who bow and nod, yet none who dare see the world differently. You are fragile, yes, but fragility is not the same as weakness. You will stay here in my court, and I will see if the worth I sense in you is real." Ethan felt a storm of confusion. He had been dragged across stars as a prisoner, mocked as worthless, nearly discarded like waste. And now he stood in the heart of power being told he had value. He could not yet believe it, yet he could not deny the fire in her words. The Empress raised a hand and her soldiers unlocked his chains. The weight fell from his wrists and for the first time in many days, he stood free, though freedom within. These walls was still a cage of another kind. She gestured for him to rise. "Serve me not as a slave," she said, "but as one who may prove himself. Fail me, and you will be nothing. Succeed, and you may rise higher than any imagined." The attendants whispered in protest, warning her of danger, of folly, of insult to the throne. But she silenced them with calm authority. "Leave us," she ordered, and the chamber emptied until only she and Ethan remained. The silence stretched, heavy yet not cruel. She looked at him as though waiting for something more. Ethan stood tall, though his legs trembled, and he said quietly, "Then give me a chance to prove that humans are more than fragile bones." The Empress leaned back, her eyes steady on his, and for the first time he saw the faint curve of her lips. The fragile human had entered her palace, not as property, but as possibility. And though the world beyond still mocked his kind, within these walls a new path had begun to open. The hidden value of a human days passed inside the palace, and Ethan began to see the world that surrounded the Empress. It was a world of endless wealth and power, where every hall was carved with history, and every chamber guarded by soldiers whose armor shone brighter than silver. Yet beneath all the shine there was a constant weight of tension, whispers of rivalry among nobles, endless voices of advisors each seeking their own gain. Ethan watched it all quietly, a stranger in a place where even servants belonged to houses older than his entire species. He walked the marble corridors with eyes that saw not glory but cages of pride. The Empress kept him close, though she never explained why to others. She called him when the court assembled. She allowed him to listen when generals spoke of borders and battles, and she asked him questions no one expected. She would turn from her throne and look at him directly, her voice calm but carrying command. "Tell me, human, what do you see in this matter?" And though his answers were clumsy at first, though he feared to speak in front of her advisors, he found courage each time her eyes held his. One day, a council gathered to discuss a trade agreement with a rival system. Advisors spoke in heavy words, layers of tradition and ritual, each voice repeating what the Empress already knew. When she turned to Ethan, the hall grew tense. "What do you think?" she asked. He swallowed his fear and said in a plain voice that the rival system's people were proud but tired, that endless ceremony would not move them, but a gesture of trust would. He suggested that instead of sending gifts of gold, she should allow them to keep a small piece of land they had once lost in war. The chamber erupted in outrage. Nobles shouted that it was weakness, that it was madness to give away territory. But the Empress silenced them with a single look. She studied Ethan's face as if testing the truth of his words. Days later, the message was sent as he had suggested, and when the reply arrived, it carried not insult but respect. The rival system agreed to trade, and for the first time in many cycles the border quieted. The court was stunned, but none dared question her choice. In the evenings, Ethan was taken to quieter halls where the Empress spoke to him alone. She asked about his home world, about skies of blue and oceans of salt water, about forests that breathed and winds that sang. He told her of mountains that touched clouds and rivers that cut through valleys. She listened as though these things were treasures beyond measure, as though the fragile human carried in his memory a world more beautiful than any crown. She began to see him not only as a voice, but as a mirror that reflected what her empire had lost. Her advisors thought only of conquest and control, but the human spoke of freedom and survival, of a people who had endured, not because they were strongest, but because they refused to surrender. She found in his words a strength that no warrior could offer. The court, however, grew restless. Nobles whispered that the Empress had been charmed by a slave, that she risked the dignity of her crown by keeping him near. Generals muttered that humans were dangerous in ways unseen, that his mind might twist her decisions. Some even plotted to remove him quietly, to end the embarrassment before it grew. Ethan sensed the hostility in their stares, but he did not retreat. He had lived too long in chains to bow before whispers. One night, as he walked through the garden, where the flowers glowed in strange colors, he was confronted by one of the Empress's generals. The man stood tall in heavy armor, his voice low and hard. "You should leave before you are cast out. You are nothing here. Fragile flesh with no claws. Do not think the Empress's favor will last." Ethan met his gaze and said only, "Then prove I am wrong. Outlast me if you can." The general's eyes narrowed, but he walked away with silence. Ethan returned to his quarters that night, with the weight of danger heavy on him, yet he also carried pride. He knew he was being tested not by the Empress alone, but by the entire empire that could not accept weakness as value. He thought of the chains that once bound him, and he swore he would never wear them again. Empress herself seemed aware of the storms rising around him. When they spoke again, she asked, "Do you fear the hatred of my court?" He answered honestly, "I fear nothing more than being useless. If they hate me, let them. But if I can prove worth, their voices will fade." She regarded him with quiet thought and then said, "You speak as though you have already chosen your place." He met her eyes and said, "I have chosen to stand." Not long after, news arrived of unrest on the edges of her empire. A hostile fleet threatened a border world stronger and faster than expected. The court gathered in panic, voices clashing over strategies, each plan more complex than the last. The Empress listened, but her gaze drifted to Ethan. She saw his calm face among the storm of advisors, and she asked once more, "What do you see?" Ethan spoke of what he had learned in war back on Earth. Not battles of machines, but battles of survival. He told them that sometimes the strongest armies fall because they underestimate those who appear weak. He suggested not to meet the enemy in open space, but to draw them into narrow paths where their numbers would mean nothing. His words were simple, almost too simple for generals who spoke in endless layers of tactics. They dismissed him with scorn, but the Empress listened. She ordered that his plan be tested, and though the generals grumbled, her word was law. When the battle came, the enemy fleet was lured into the narrow corridors of an asteroid field. Trapped and confused, their larger ships became clumsy targets. The Empress's fleet struck swift and hard, turning certain defeat into stunning victory. The Empire cheered, the generals were humbled, and Ethan stood quietly at her side, knowing that his fragile human mind had saved countless lives. But with victory came even greater whispers. Some nobles now feared him more than they mocked him. They whispered that the Empress trusted him too deeply, that he would soon shape the empire itself. The fragile human had become more than curiosity, he had become dangerous. The Empress, however, saw only truth. She looked upon him not as a toy or a slave, but as something rare. Fragile, yes, but filled with a resilience that her strongest warriors could never grasp. And in her silence she began to wonder if the universe had mocked humans too soon. The test of survival. The palace was restless in the days after the victory at the border world. Nobles walked the halls with sharp whispers. Soldiers carried their weapons as though an unseen enemy stood behind every corner, and servants hurried with lowered heads, fearing that even their footsteps might be heard too loudly. The Empress moved among them with calm grace, yet her silence carried more weight than 1,000 words. She had seen how the fragile human had turned the tide of battle with nothing but insight, and she knew that the court would never look at him the same. Again, Ethan himself felt the change pressing against him. Where once there had been only mockery, now there was suspicion. And where there had been dismissal, now there was fear. Eyes followed him in every corridor, voices hushed when he passed, and more than once he felt the cold shadow of hatred pressing close. Yet he walked with steady steps, for he knew that the Empress's trust was his shield, and he swore within himself that he would not allow that trust to be broken. The test came sooner than any expected. A fleet larger than any before struck deep into the Empire, not with the clumsy arrogance of earlier foes, but with precision and cunning. They attacked supply routes, burned colonies, and vanished before the fleet could strike back. The generals argued with fury in the council chamber, their plans clashing like swords, and for days no decision could be reached. The Empire trembled on the edge of chaos. The Empress listened, but spoke little. At last she turned her eyes upon Ethan where he stood at the edge of the chamber. Her voice was calm, yet it cut through the storm of argument. "What do you see this time?" The room fell silent as every noble and general turned their gaze toward the human. Some sneered, others frowned, but none dared speak against the will of their ruler. Ethan took a breath, his mind racing through the fragments of maps he had seen, the whispers of fear he had heard, and the simple truths of survival that had shaped his people. He spoke slowly, not with the heavy words of advisors, but with plain thought. He said that the enemy was strong because they struck where the Empire least expected. He said that chasing them with greater force would only leave the Empire empty and weak. Instead, he suggested drawing the enemy toward what seemed weak but was in truth prepared. He spoke of setting a trap not with weapons alone, but with patience, using silence as bait until the enemy struck where the Empress desired. The generals muttered in disbelief, yet the Empress's eyes remained fixed on him. After a long pause, she nodded and declared that his plan would be followed. The court erupted with anger, but her word was final. Ethan left the chamber knowing that once more he carried the weight of countless lives on his shoulders. The days that followed were filled with waiting. Ships moved quietly into hidden positions. Colonies spread false signals of weakness, and scouts vanished into the dark between stars. Ethan watched it all with a heavy heart. He was no soldier, no commander, yet his ideas now shaped fleets and armies. He remembered the chains of the market and wondered at the path that had carried him here. When the enemy came, they came with fury. Their fleet swept down upon a colony they believed defenseless, confident in their speed and strength. Yet as they closed in the silence of space, broke apart with fire. Hidden ships emerged from the dark, weapons blazing, and the narrow lanes of the system trapped the enemy where their numbers meant nothing. The battle raged with thunder that shook the void itself. Ethan stood beside the Empress on the command bridge, watching the storm unfold. He saw enemy ships torn apart by ambush, saw his plan take shape in fire and steel, yet he also saw the cost. The Empire's ships bled under the strain, men and women fell in sacrifice, and the outcome hung upon a blade of chance. At one moment, a wave of enemy craft broke through the lines and drove straight toward the command ship. Panic rippled through the crew. The generals shouted orders, weapons fired, but the danger came closer. Ethan felt the weight of decision upon him. Without thought for rank or fear, he stepped forward and shouted for the fleet to break formation, to lure the attackers into the field of debris left by earlier wreckage. The crew hesitated, unsure whether to obey a human, but the Empress's voice rang clear. Do as he says. The maneuver was carried out in desperate speed. The enemy pursued with reckless hunger and found themselves caught in the deadly fragments of broken ships. Their hulls tore against the sharp remains, their engines failed, and the Empire's ships struck them down one by one until silence returned to the void. Victory was theirs. The command bridge erupted in cries of triumph. Yet, amid the joy, there was also shock. The fragile human had stood once more at the heart of survival, his voice guiding an Empire's fleet to safety. The Empress looked at him not with surprise, but with calm satisfaction, as though she had seen this truth long before the rest. But the danger was not only in the stars. In the shadows of the palace, nobles gathered with hatred sharper than knives. They whispered that the human was a threat greater than the enemy, that his presence weakened tradition, that the Empress's trust blinded her to peril. They spoke of ways to end him quietly, to erase the fragile creature before he reshaped the Empire itself. Ethan felt the danger closing around him, yet he did not falter. He had seen death too closely to fear it now. He knew that the Empress had placed her faith in him, not because of strength of body, but because of strength of spirit. And he resolved that whatever test came next, he would meet it with the same fire. The Empress summoned him alone after the battle, and her eyes searched his face with rare softness. You risked much today, she said, and yet you did not break. Ethan answered simply, I am human. We are fragile, yes, but we do not break as easily as they think. She held his gaze for a long moment, and in that silence there was the weight of choice. The fragile human had proven his worth not once but twice, and yet the world around them grew ever more restless. The true test was still to come, a test not only of war but of loyalty, of trust, of survival against the very heart of her empire. The Empress turned away at last, her voice steady. Then stand ready, Ethan, for the Empire is watching, and it will judge us both. The Empress's choice, the palace was heavy with silence after the great battle. Celebration ran through the Empire, but within the golden halls danger still whispered. The nobles had not forgotten their fear of the fragile human. Some admired the victories he had brought, yet more of them despised the idea that a creature from a forgotten world could hold the ear of their ruler. Their envy grew sharp and their hatred deep. They spoke in chambers hidden by shadow. They planned not against the enemy beyond the stars, but against the one who walked beside their Empress. Ethan felt it, though no one spoke to him directly. He could see the coldness in their eyes when he passed through the council chamber. He could hear the murmurs cut short whenever he entered a hall. Guards loyal to the nobles often stared too long at him, as though measuring whether his throat would be easy to cut. Yet he did not shrink from their looks. He had been mocked before, and he had been chained before. He told himself that if he could survive chains, he could survive whispers too. The Empress, however, knew more than whispers. She had spies in every corridor and shadows that carried her secrets. She learned that a plot was rising, one meant to strike not at her throne, but at the human she had chosen. When she heard it, she did not show fear. She only waited, and she only watched. She wanted to know whether the fragile man would bend under the storm, or whether he would stand once more. The night of the plot came quickly. Ethan was walking the garden alone, the same garden where flowers glowed in strange colors beneath the moons. The air was cool, and the silence of night was deep. Then shadows moved among the trees. Cloaked figures stepped out, their blades shining in pale light. They said nothing, but their intent was clear. They circled him like hunters around prey. Ethan felt his heart pound, but he did not run. Running would only prove them right. He picked up a fallen branch from the ground. It was weak and light, nothing compared to their blades, yet he held it firmly. The first attacker rushed, and Ethan struck with all his strength. The branch broke, but it staggered the assassin long enough for Ethan to move aside. Another swung and cut his arm, yet he refused to fall. He fought with desperation, not skill, using stone and branch and fist. Each strike was a cry of defiance. The assassins pressed harder, and Ethan's strength began to fade. He stumbled, and one raised his blade high for the final cut. But before it could fall, the garden filled with light. Soldiers of the Empress stormed in, their weapons flashing. In moments the assassins were overpowered, dragged to the ground in chains. Ethan fell to his knees, bleeding yet alive. He raised his head and saw the Empress herself step into the garden. She looked at him with eyes that held no surprise. She had known this moment would come. She had allowed it to come. She wanted to see if the fragile human would face death without surrender. And now she had her answer. She knelt beside him and placed her hand on his shoulder. You have stood against enemies of the Empire and against enemies within. You have risked yourself not for crown nor reward, but because you will not bend. This is what they do not understand about you. This is why I chose you. Ethan's breath was heavy, but his voice was steady. They will never stop. As long as I stand beside you, they will come again. The Empress rose to her feet, and her voice ran clear over the garden. Then let them come. Let them see that what they call fragile is stronger than all their hatred. She turned to her guards. Bring the nobles who plotted this before me. They will face judgment. The next day, the grand hall of the palace was filled. Nobles gathered with trembling voices, generals stood silent, and the air was heavy with fear. The captured assassins were thrown before the throne, their cloaks torn away to reveal the faces of men once trusted in court. The Empress rose, and her voice thundered across the chamber. You mocked the human I chose. You called him fragile, worthless, a weakness to the Empire. Yet he has saved you in battle, and he has faced your blades without fear. You sought to kill him in shadows, but he has stood in the light. You call yourselves strong, yet you hide behind schemes and poison. Tell me then, who is fragile? No voice dared answer. The hall was silent as stone. The Empress turned and held out her hand to Ethan, who stood beside the throne, his arm bandaged, yet his back straight. From this day, she declared, he will not stand as slave or as prisoner. He will stand as my advisor, bound to no chain. But duty, and his voice will carry as much weight as any in this court. Gasps filled the hall. Some bowed in anger, others in fear, but none dared defy her. The fragile human had been raised higher than any of them could have imagined. He had been bought at an auction where no one would bid, and now he stood beside the most powerful ruler in the stars. Ethan felt the weight of the moment. He was no longer the forgotten prisoner mocked for weakness. He was no longer the man in chains. He stood not because his body was strong, but because his spirit refused to fall. He met the eyes of the nobles who had scorned him, and for the first time they looked away. The Empress spoke one final time, her words sealing the truth for all to hear. Strength is not always in bone or muscle. Sometimes it is in will, sometimes in mind, sometimes in the fire that refuses to die. You called him fragile. I call him indispensable. The hall erupted with cries of loyalty, though many were hollow. The Empress cared little for hollow words. She had made her choice. She had proven her point. And in the days that followed, the empire began to change. Whispers of humans spread beyond the palace, no longer only of weakness but of hidden strength. Ethan walked the corridors with his head high. He still bore scars, he still carried doubts, but he no longer carried chains. He knew the path ahead would not be easy. There would always be enemies, always those who feared what they did not understand. But he also knew that he was no longer alone. The Empress had chosen him, and he had chosen to stand. And so the fragile human, once unwanted, became the voice that shifted an empire. His story began in chains and ended in honor, not because he was stronger than others, but because he refused to surrender when surrender was all the world expected. The end.